Sandra Bullock had it all: fame, fortune, and Oscar in her hand. But just days later, everything shattered. Betrayed, stalked, grieving. She disappeared from Hollywood's spotlight, not in shame, but in silent strength. This isn't just a story of success. It's a story of survival, motherhood, and the quiet kind of power we rarely see. Let's uncover the life behind the spotlight and the legacy Sandra Bullock built far away from the cameras. Before Sandra Bullock ever learned how to speak, she learned how to listen to music, to languages, to the quiet space between two cultures. She was born in Arlington, Virginia, but her roots were stretched across continents. Her mother, Helga Meyer, was a German opera singer. Her father, John Bullock, a United States Army employee and vocal coach. And from the very beginning, Sandra lived between two worlds, never fully of one or the other. As a child, Sandra followed the rhythm of opera tours like footsteps through a shifting home. From the grand stages of Vienna to the modest neighborhoods of Nuremberg, she was cradled not by one country, but by many. Her lullabies were arias. Her playdates were backstage. Her toys were suitcases. She moved from Germany to Austria to the US. Back and forth, caught in a whirlwind of languages, customs, and expectations. But when she returned to America for good, everything changed. She was just a girl with a German accent and foreign clothes walking into an American classroom. She didn't talk like the other kids. She didn't act like them either. In Northern Virginia, her European manners, her thick accent, her awkwardness, all of it made her a target. She wasn't bullied because she was weak. She was bullied because she was different. And so she grew quiet. Sandra learned how to hide in plain sight. She stopped speaking German at school. She tried to blend in. She studied the patterns of American teenage girls like she was learning a new role. But nothing quite fit. Her silence wasn't just survival, it was self-preservation. Behind that silence, though, something began to grow. Not resentment, not anger, empathy. Because when you're the one on the outside looking in, you begin to notice the other outsiders. The janitor who never spoke. The girl in the corner of the cafeteria. The kid who ate alone. Sandra saw them not out of pity, but recognition. Her sense of isolation gave her something far more valuable than attention. It gave her understanding. That understanding would one day shape every role she played. But back then, she wasn't an actress. She was just a girl walking between cultures, carrying a voice she wasn't ready to use yet. She was a star born into silence, but not destined to remain there. In Sandra's world, words were never just words. They were shields, weapons, bridges, and sometimes betrayals. She grew up speaking German with her mother, feeling comfort in the softness of vowels, the lull of her mother's singing voice echoing through their home. German was warmth, memory, security. But in America, that language marked her as foreign. Her accent became a scar, so she buried it. English, she learned, was not just a language, it was survival. It was how you made friends, how you avoided the stares, how you stopped being the weird kid. And she worked at it, relentlessly, mimicking TV shows, repeating commercials, listening to the way her classmates spoke, dissecting every rhythm, every slang word, every pause. But no matter how fluent she became, something never clicked. She wasn't fully German anymore. She wasn't fully American either. She was split between two selves, one that knew how to curtsy at opera galas, and one that knew how to order a burger without stuttering. One that held on to traditions, and one that just wanted to belong. It was a quiet war, and it made her feel like she was never enough for either side. This duality, though, gave her an unexpected gift. It allowed her to slip in and out of personas, to understand nuance, to read people beyond their words. She didn't just hear, she felt. And that instinct born of pain and dislocation would later become the foundation of her acting. She could become anyone, not because she was pretending, but because she had lived through being no one. She also began to notice what others missed. The boy who flinched when teachers raised their voice. The girl who smiled too hard to hide the cracks. The mother in the supermarket with quiet tears and no wedding ring. Sandra didn't just pass them by, she felt them, because invisibility had been her language for years. That compassion grew into her backbone. It hardened her will, but softened her spirit. In a world that demands masks, Sandra's deepest rebellion would be empathy. She didn't forget what it meant to feel like a ghost in your own life. In the silence of two languages, she learned something rare: to speak with her soul, not just her mouth. And one day, that soul would command the world's attention. There's a myth about New York that it turns dreamers into stars. But the truth is, it often turns them into waitresses with broken shoes and aching hearts. Sandra Bullock arrived in that myth with more grit than glamour, more hope than certainty. Just a few credits short of her degree in drama from East Carolina University, she made the choice no one understood. She walked away from the classroom and into the chaos of Manhattan. She didn't bring a backup plan, just ambition and an old suitcase. The city was everything and nothing like the stories. Its skyline didn't sparkle. It loomed. Its streets didn't sing. They howled. Her apartment was barely an apartment, just a shoebox with creaky pipes and paper-thin walls where winter slept beside her, and silence was a permanent roommate. There was no heater strong enough to fight the cold, no blanket thick enough to smother the doubts. She got by on side jobs, cocktail waitress, hostess, dog walker, tote checker, at a divey jazz bar where the tips were as thin as the air outside. Some nights, she earned just enough for one meal. Others, she rationed instant noodles like they were luxury cuisine. There were mornings she woke up to frozen water in her sink. Evenings when she counted coins, not dreams. But inside that exhaustion was a fire that never went out. Every spare second she rehearsed. In the mirror, in the dark, on the subway. She would whisper dialogue under her breath while washing glasses. She'd study the strangers who walked past her, imagining their secrets, their stories, their sadness. Each one a character in the life she hadn't lived yet but would one day portray. Auditions came and went. She'd wait in line for hours for a single chance, a single reading, only to be met with polite rejection or no response at all. Sometimes the casting directors wouldn't even look up from their notes. She was too this, not enough that. Too green, too intense, too forgettable. But Sandra didn't stop. Because this wasn't a phase. It wasn't a whim. Acting wasn't what she did. It was what she was. Every no chipped away at her ego, but not her will. With every closed door, she grew sharper, more focused, more certain that one day someone would see her. Not just the face or the resume, but the soul. And then came the small parts. A guest role on a sitcom, a bit in a student film, blink and you miss it roles where her name barely made the credits. But each one was a rung in the ladder. Each one proof that she was climbing slowly, painfully, but upward. New York didn't make her famous. It made her resilient. Because when you've learned how to hold your breath through loneliness, how to laugh through hunger, and how to smile through rejection, nothing scares you anymore. Not critics, not failure, not even obscurity. She didn't come to New York to be a star. She came to learn how to fight for herself. And when the moment finally came, when the world was finally watching, Sandra Bullock wasn't just ready. She was unstoppable. Hollywood didn't choose Sandra Bullock. She forced its hand with a folding chair and a paper plate. It was 1993, and Sandra had landed a few supporting roles enough to pay the rent, but not enough to be remembered. She was still that girl in a sea of auditions, still walking into rooms filled with brighter names and shinier resumes. And then came Speed, a low-budget action movie about a bomb on a bus. Not exactly Shakespeare, but it had something rare a role that wasn't just decorative. It needed presence, wit, heart. It needed her. But the studio didn't see it that way. They had their shortlists names with box office pull faces on magazine covers. Sandra wasn't on any of them. So when she walked into the audition room, she brought something no one expected: a beat-up folding chair and a flimsy paper plate. No explanation, no drama. She just placed them down and sat. Because in the movie, her character Annie was a regular woman thrust into chaos. Someone who ate breakfast like anyone else. Someone who didn't expect to become a hero. Sandra wanted to be her, not pretend to be her. No glamour, no pretense, just honesty. And the room noticed. Then came the chemistry test with Keanu Reeves. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't coached. But something electric happened. Not romance, something better: authenticity. They bounced off each other like two frequencies finding harmony. She made him laugh. He made her relax. It felt real, not like a movie, but like life. And the producers saw it. For the first time, they really saw her. Speed was supposed to be a modest summer flick. But when it hit theaters in 1994, it exploded, not just because of the thrills, but because of her. Annie wasn't a damsel. She wasn't an action prop. She was messy, funny, terrified, brave, and utterly human. Audiences didn't just root for her. They believed in her. In a single weekend, Sandra Bullock went from that girl in that thing to Hollywood's most bankable new star. But this wasn't luck. This was the payoff of years in silence, years of waiting tables, years of being told you're not the one. When Speed hit, it didn't create Sandra Bullock. It revealed her to a world that had been looking the other way. And through it all, she never forgot the chair, the plate, the spark that came not from fame, but from truth. Because the real explosion wasn't on the bus. It was in her, and it had been waiting to detonate all along. Hollywood is full of stars who rise fast and fall faster, swallowed by the machine they once dreamed of entering. But Sandra Bullock wasn't just chasing roles. She was building a home, one she could control, one no one could take from her. After Speed catapulted her to stardom, scripts flooded in. Romantic comedies, action sequels, generic roles written by men who had never met a woman like her. She took some, yes, but behind the scenes, Sandra began to do something very few actresses dared to do. In the 90s, she started saying no, and more importantly, she started saying, mine. She founded Fortis Films, a production company with one radical idea: that a woman could tell her own stories, produce her own work, and own the stage she stood on. Fortis wasn't just a logo at the end of credits. It was a rebellion in an industry that expected actresses to smile, obey, and disappear before 40. With Fortis, Sandra stepped off the path and carved her own. She produced and starred in Hope Floats, a story about brokenness and renewal set not in Manhattan or Los Angeles, but in the quiet, aching spaces of small-town America. She followed it with Miss Congeniality, a sharp, ridiculous, lovable comedy where she played an FBI agent turned beauty queen, clumsy, yet commanding, awkward, yet irresistible. The movie became a box office hit and a feminist Trojan horse in a world of pageants and stereotypes. And then came 2 weeks' notice while you were sleeping. Practical magic hits that didn't just entertain, but gave women space to be messy, strong, complicated, and funny. Sandra wasn't just choosing roles. She was rewriting what it meant to be a leading woman, not flawless, not invincible, but real. But perhaps her boldest move was behind the camera. She championed the George Lopez sitcom not just as producer, but as protector. At a time when Latino representation in mainstream TV was nearly invisible, Sandra put her weight behind a Mexican-American comedian with heart history and grit. The show ran for 6 seasons and changed the cultural conversation. Because Sandra understood something vital: power is not just having a voice, it's using it to open doors for others. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She built the stage, lit the spotlight, and invited the unheard to step forward. And through it all, no tabloid scandals, no PR tricks, just the quiet force of a woman who knew exactly who she was becoming. For every actor, there's a night they dream of the bright lights of the Dolby Theater, the heavy gold statue, the applause echoing like a promise that everything was worth it. For Sandra Bullock, that night arrived in March 2010. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for The Blind Side, playing Leaky Ann Tuohy, a fierce Southern woman who opens her home and her heart to a homeless black teenager. The role was powerful, raw, and deeply human, and Sandra brought it to life with a strength that resonated far beyond the screen. It was her first Oscar nomination and her first win. As she stood on that stage holding the golden statue in trembling hands, she laughed, she cried. She thanked her mother, her son, her peers. The room rose to its feet. At last, Hollywood wasn't just applauding the America's sweetheart image. They were acknowledging her craft, her depth, her command. But what the cameras didn't see was what she had just discovered: that while the world was celebrating her greatest professional triumph, her personal life was silently shattering. Just days before the ceremony, whispers had started. And within 10 days of the Oscar win, the whispers turned into headlines. Her husband, Jesse James, had been unfaithful. The betrayal wasn't just private, it was public, brutal, relentless. The tabloids feasted. The fairy tale unraveled in real time. Photos, accusations, interviews, each day a new humiliation. For Sandra, it wasn't just the collapse of a marriage. It was the collapse of trust, of safety, of the life she thought she had built outside the spotlight. She had held her Oscar with grace. Now she held her heartbreak in silence. And yet she never lashed out. No angry interviews, no media spectacle. She vanished. Because while the world was still talking about The Blind Side, Sandra was living her blind side, blindsided by the very person she had once called her home. But there was one secret she had kept from the world. One that would become her anchor. In the midst of the awards season, long before the scandal broke, Sandra had quietly begun the process of adopting a child. A baby boy named Louis. She had planned to announce it after the Oscars, after the media circus faded, when her family felt whole. Instead, she found herself alone, holding that baby in her arms, no longer as a wife, but as a mother, a single mother. Her life had split in two before the Oscar and after. And yet, in that division, something new was born. A deeper strength, a fiercer love. In the wreckage of betrayal, she didn't just survive, she transformed. When the cameras faded and the dresses were returned, when the headlines moved on to their next scandal, Sandra Bullock was still standing in the wreckage alone, but not broken. In her arms was something far more precious than an Oscar statue or a red carpet moment. His name was Louis. She had kept the adoption process a secret, a sacred plan between her and Jesse, a promise to reveal their new family together once the award season was over. She had pictured it, a joyful announcement, a moment of celebration. But that future was stolen. Betrayal rewrote the story. And so, instead of sharing her joy with the world, Sandra went silent. While gossip shows speculated and the public dissected every detail of her collapse, she was rocking her newborn son to sleep in a darkened room far from Hollywood, far from judgment. No press release, no interviews, just quiet lullabies, midnight feedings, and a fierce commitment to shield her child from the chaos. Motherhood wasn't an escape. It was a rebirth. This wasn't a performance. There was no script, no second take. Sandra learned how to swaddle with trembling hands. She cried in silence while holding a bottle. She laughed for the first time in weeks when Louis smiled. In him, she found the only truth she needed: love that asked for nothing but presence. She didn't need the world to approve. She needed it to go away. So she retreated from premieres, from deals, from the noise. Hollywood waited curious, but Sandra didn't return their calls. Her son came first. In interviews years later, she would refer to Louis as her little wise old soul, the child who came into her life exactly when she needed to be reminded of what mattered. He grounded her. He saved her. She once said, "The only man who has ever stolen my heart is my son." Every day, she stepped deeper into motherhood, and slowly she rebuilt. Not with revenge, not with rage, but with intention. She created a home with no paparazzi, no whispers, no shadows from the past. Just light softness, healing. She didn't let the scandal define her. She let love redefine her. Sandra Bullock had played heroes on screen. But it was in the quiet, sleepless nights, holding a baby in one arm and her broken heart in the other, that she became one in real life. For most actors, Hollywood is a race louder, faster, shinier. But Sandra Bullock had learned that true power wasn't found in noise. It was found in stillness, in silence in space. In 2013, that truth took physical form in a film unlike anything she had ever attempted. Gravity wasn't just a movie, it was a gamble. A nearly one-woman show set against the infinite blackness of space with Sandra as Dr. Ryan Stone, a medical engineer adrift after a catastrophic accident, leaves her untethered from Earth, spinning endlessly in orbit. There were no ensembles, no love stories, no witty repartee. Just her alone. And it was that very isolation that mirrored something deeper. Because by this point, Sandra Bullock had lived her own kind of gravity. The kind that comes after betrayal, after loss, after starting over with a newborn in one arm and paparazzi on every corner. She knew what it meant to float unanchored, unsure if you'll ever find solid ground again. Cuarón, the film's director, saw something in her, not just star power, but stillness. A woman who could speak volumes with a glance, who could hold silence longer than most could hold breath. He wanted authenticity, and Sandra gave him nothing less than her entire body, voice, and soul. The physical demands were extraordinary. Sandra spent months inside custom-built rigs that rotated her mid-air, imitating zero gravity with exhausting precision. Most of her scenes were filmed inside a small cube-like chamber, isolated from the crew with only a headset to receive direction. She performed alone, reacting to imagined chaos, to loss, to the terrifying void of space, all from within her own imagination. She rehearsed breaths like they were dialogue, controlled every blink. Let tears float upward, not fall. When the film was released, the world stopped. Critics were stunned. Audiences were breathless. Gravity became one of the highest-grossing films of the year, earning over $700 million worldwide and 10 Academy Award nominations. Sandra was nominated once again for Best Actress, and while the statue eluded her this time, the performance sealed her legacy. But there was another story, one hidden behind contracts and quiet negotiations. Sandra had secured a revolutionary deal, $20 million up front, and a cut of box office profits. By the time the film completed its theatrical run, She had earned over $70 million, making her one of the highest-paid actors, male or female, in history. It wasn't about money. It was about value. She wasn't just cast. She was the film. She didn't join the industry. She now led it. Sandra Bullock had done what few women in Hollywood ever achieved. She turned stillness into power, minimalism into magnetism, and solitude into a universal story of survival. And from the depths of heartbreak to the cold silence of space, she had never floated away. She had only grown stronger, pulled not by gravity, but by purpose. When the world of entertainment began to shift, when theaters dimmed and algorithms rose, many stars paused, unsure of how to navigate this new terrain. Streaming wasn't just a format change, it was a revolution. The red carpet was replaced by the autoplay button, and for a generation of actors who had built their careers on box office numbers, the change felt threatening. But not to Sandra Bullock. She didn't resist the wave. She rode it. In 2018, Netflix released a quiet experimental thriller titled Bird Box. The premise was strange, the marketing minimal, and the expectations modest. But when Sandra Bullock appeared on screen blindfolded, vulnerable, commanding, everything changed. The film became a global phenomenon, watched by over 80 million accounts in its first month. Memes exploded. Challenges went viral. And once again, Sandra was not just part of the moment. She was the moment. But what stunned critics most was not the viral success, it was her. Sandra carried the film with raw emotion, portraying a mother protecting her children in a world where opening your eyes could kill you. It was a metaphor, beautifully quiet and devastating. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk blindly, guided only by instinct and love. And audiences felt that deeply. Bird Box redefined streaming cinema. It proved that an original film led by a woman in her 50s could dominate not just the industry, but global conversation. But Sandra didn't stop there. In the unforgivable 2021, she went even further, portraying an ex-convict struggling to reintegrate into society after committing an unforgivable crime. It was dark, heavy, and morally ambiguous, a departure from her earlier roles. But that was the point. She was no longer interested in likability. She was interested in truth. Audiences saw a different Sandra, haunted, hollowed human. And once again, she was the centerpiece of a streaming hit, commanding critical and audience attention alike. Then came The Lost City 2022, a return to comedy, but with a twist. It was bold, absurd, full of pink sequins, jungle chaos, and one very unexpected Brad Pitt cameo. And it was produced by Sandra herself. The film premiered in theaters, yes, but found a second life on streaming, topping charts and winning over new generations. From thriller to drama to romantic comedy, Sandra moved through genres like a master of her craft. Not chasing trends, defining them. She didn't need a summer blockbuster to prove her worth. She had millions watching her on their phones, their laptops, their living rooms across every corner of the world. And perhaps the most powerful thing, she did it on her own terms, producing, selecting, creating stories that mattered to her. In a world obsessed with youth, Sandra Bullock, now in her late 50s, was not just surviving the digital age of cinema, she was reigning in it. For all the red carpets, awards, and headlines, Sandra Bullock had always clung fiercely to one thing: privacy. Her sanctuary wasn't a mansion. It was a space beyond the spotlight, a home, a silence, a safety she had built brick by brick for her children and herself. But on one summer night in 2014, even that sanctuary shattered. It started with a noise, a creak, a whisper of movement that didn't belong. Sandra had just returned home from the Spike TV Guys' Choice Awards. She was alone. Her son Louis was thankfully with a nanny that night. Around 1 a.m., she heard footsteps. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the kind of trick the mind plays in the stillness of a big house. But then came the undeniable sound of a door closing. Someone was inside. In that moment, time froze. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She hid in a closet, heart pounding against her ribs, breath shallow with fear. Clutching her phone, she dialed 911, her voice barely more than a whisper. The dispatcher tried to keep her calm as she described the sounds, the fear, the disbelief that someone had breached the most sacred place in her world. Police arrived, guns drawn. The intruder, a man named Joshua Corbett, was arrested inside her home. In his possession, a notebook filled with disturbing writings, obsessions, and delusions about Sandra. It wasn't a random crime. It was a fixation. Though no physical harm came to her that night, something far deeper was broken. The aftermath didn't play out in tabloids. It played out in therapy. Sandra was diagnosed with PTSD. The kind that doesn't scream, but whispers constantly in your ear. You're not safe. She suffered from anxiety, insomnia, hypervigilance. Every creak in the house became a trigger. Every night, a test of endurance. She began EMDR therapy, a specialized treatment used for trauma survivors, soldiers, victims, survivors of intimate violence. She never made it a spectacle. She never spoke about it for attention. She did it because she had to heal, not for herself alone, but for her children. Because fear, she knew, was contagious. She strengthened security, doubled her privacy, built a fortress not of walls, but of boundaries. To the public, she was still the composed actress, the red carpet queen. But inside, she was a woman reclaiming her breath night after night, step by step. She had survived betrayal, heartbreak, loneliness. But this, a violation of safety, left the deepest scar. Still, she chose not to surrender to fear. She chose to fight for peace, for protection, for the right to feel safe in her own skin. Because even when the world feels dangerous, a mother does not crumble. She fortifies. For years, love had been a dangerous word in Sandra Bullock's life. A word once filled with light, later soaked in betrayal, then buried beneath the rubble of heartbreak. After her divorce, after the stalker, after the sleepless nights, love felt like something meant for other people. Until one day, quietly without fanfare, it returned. Brian Randall wasn't a Hollywood actor. He wasn't a producer, a screenwriter, or a power player. He was a photographer, quiet, rugged, with a gentle presence that didn't demand attention. They met in 2015 when Sandra hired him to photograph her son Louis's birthday party. It was supposed to be just another job for him, just another appointment for her. But love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it walks in with a camera and a soft laugh. There was no whirlwind romance, no tabloid spectacle, just moments small, meaningful, real. Sandra had spent so much of her life being everything to everyone. On sets, in interviews, in motherhood. But with Brian, she could be herself, unguarded, unpolished, unfiltered. He didn't need the movie star. He saw the woman, the mother, the fighter, the soul. In time, they grew into a family, not with a diamond ring, but with love rooted in choice. Sandra never felt the need to remarry. She once said, "I don't need a paper to be a devoted partner." What they had was deeper than vows spoken once. It was lived every day. And then came Layla. In 2015, Sandra adopted her second child. A fierce, beautiful little girl from the foster care system. Layla had experienced trauma, fear, instability, but in Sandra's arms, she found home, And in Brian's presence, she found safety. Together, they became something rare in Hollywood, a quiet, private, complete family. Not curated for Instagram, not staged for paparazzi, just real. They played board games, took walks, laughed in kitchens, and whispered bedtime stories. They built a life that didn't care for approval, only for peace. Sandra often referred to Brian as the love of my life, not because of grand gestures, but because of presence. He was there in the mess, in the joy, in the mundane, in the sacred. He didn't try to fix her. He simply held space for her to be whole. And for the first time since her heart had been broken open, she allowed it to beat fully again. This wasn't the fairy tale Hollywood loves to sell. There was no ball, no crown, no prince, just a woman who had been through hell, and a man who knew how to stand beside her in silence and say, "You're safe now." Some storms announce themselves with thunder. Others creep in quietly, invisible, irreversible. In 2020, while the world was retreating into quarantine and uncertainty, Sandra Bullock was facing a more private, devastating reality. Brian Randall, the love of her life, had been diagnosed with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a rare and incurable neurodegenerative disease, a thief in slow motion. It began with small signs, a hand that wouldn't move the way it used to, muscle twitches, subtle changes in balance, strength, speech, the kind of things most people would brush off until they couldn't. The diagnosis came like a sentence not just to Brian, but to everyone who loved him. Sandra didn't make a statement. She didn't run to the media or stage a story of suffering. She disappeared, not into hiding, but into love. She paused her career. She turned down projects. She stopped walking red carpets. Because while the world speculated about her absence, Sandra was living a reality more urgent than fame. She became a caregiver, a nurse, a protector, a partner. ALS doesn't just steal movement, it steals speech independence identity. And as Brian's world grew smaller, as his body betrayed him one muscle at a time, Sandra stood beside him, holding what the disease couldn't touch: dignity. She converted rooms in their home for medical care, oversaw therapies, hired support staff, but she was there for every breath, every moment, every need. The woman who once commanded galaxies on screen now spent her days helping the man she loved eat, bathe, communicate, all while protecting their children. Because Louis and Layla were still young, they didn't need headlines, they needed stability. Sandra chose again and again to shelter them from the slow tragedy unfolding inside their home, to make it soft, bearable, even joyful, despite the shadow that hung over every dinner, every bedtime story. The disease moved quickly, too quickly. Sandra never once exploited the pain for public sympathy. She didn't need the world to know what she was enduring, because love doesn't need an audience. In rare interviews, she simply said she was taking a pause to be with her children and the people who mattered. Behind those words was a deeper truth that she was watching the love of her life fade, bit by bit, with a grace that few could bear. And in that slow vanishing, she became something far more than a star. She became a light constant, steady, refusing to dim even as the world darkened. Some people run from loss. Sandra stood inside it, not to escape, but to walk someone home. On August 5, 2023, Sandra Bullock lost the man who had stood beside her through some of her life's most sacred years. Brian Randall, the quiet soul she had called the love of my life, passed away after a private 3-year battle with ALS. He died at home, in her arms, in peace. Sandra had been there every step of the way, from the first tremors to the final breath. she held him through silence, through suffering, through the long, slow fading of a man who had once been strong. Laughing, full of life, she never left his side. The grief was bone deep. And yet there was no Instagram post, no teary press conference, no dramatic return to the spotlight. Instead, there was silence, the same silence that had defined her strength again and again. But the world didn't let her grieve. Just 9 days after Brian's death, her name began trending, and for her loss, but for a controversy she never saw coming. The Blind Side. The very film that had won her an Oscar was suddenly at the center of a public scandal. Michael Oher, the former NFL player whose life inspired the movie, claimed the Tuohy family had never legally adopted him and had profited off his story without proper compensation. And while the legal dispute had nothing to do with Sandra herself, outrage doesn't pause for nuance. Suddenly, strangers on the internet demanded she return her Oscar. Accusations flew. Comment sections swelled with judgment. Some questioned her integrity. Others called her complicit. No one asked her what it was like to bury the man she loved just days earlier. She said nothing, because what could she say? The internet was not a courtroom. It was a coliseum, and grief has no place in a viral firestorm. So Sandra did what she had always done. She chose grace. She stayed home, with her children, with her memories, with the stillness that by now she had learned to wear like armor. In a world obsessed with reactions, with clapping back, defending, debating, she chose dignity. Because grief is not a performance, and love doesn't need defending. She knew the truth of her own heart. She knew the care she had given Brian, the sleepless nights, the whispered prayers, the hand she held until the end. And so, while the world spun with noise, Sandra stood still in mourning, in motherhood, in silence. And from that silence, she taught a lesson no role ever could. That the greatest strength isn't in what you say, it's in what you endure without breaking. There comes a moment in every life when the world expects you to speak, to explain, to defend, to fight back. But Sandra Bullock, as she had done time and again, chose something harder. She chose silence. She chose dignity. In an era where every private moment is one tweet away from being public property, Sandra refused to participate in the spectacle. Her grief was not content. Her pain was not PR. And her life was no longer a storyline for others to dissect. She didn't issue statements about Brian. She didn't correct the headlines. She didn't respond to those calling for her Oscar to be returned. Instead, she chose her children. Louis and Layla, two young souls who had already endured enough loss, who had seen the strength of their mother stretched thin by sorrow, and who needed not a celebrity, but a steady hand to hold through the storm. Sandra turned inward, toward bedtime routines and school lunches, toward whispered questions and quiet reassurances, toward the sacredness of family, the ordinary rituals that the world never sees, brushing Layla's hair, helping with homework, lighting a candle beside Brian's photo. Because dignity for her was not just an abstract word. It was an act of love. It was staying off red carpets when the cameras weren't kind. It was stepping away from Hollywood when her children needed home. It was saying no to a world that had too often demanded everything. Her time, her face, her story. Sandra had built a career on knowing when to speak. Now she was proving the power of knowing when not to. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. She understood that some truths don't need defending, that peace is more valuable than vindication, and that being a mother, truly being present, sometimes means letting the world scream while you gently whisper, "I'm here. I've got you." In interviews long before her heartbreak, Sandra had once said, "I'm a good mother because I always show up." she wasn't talking about perfection. She was talking about presence, about showing up in the mess, in the fatigue, in the grief. And now she was living that truth louder than ever, not in words, but in quiet, steady love. The spotlight had been her world once. Now her greatest role was in the shadows, holding together what mattered most. And from that place of stillness, she showed the world what real strength looks like. Not in clapping back, but in carrying forward. No final bow, no farewell tour, no announcement. Sandra Bullock simply slipped away from the screen, not in defeat, but in peace. Today, she lives quietly in Los Angeles, far from the flashbulbs and interviews, in a home filled with morning sunlight and the soft rhythms of motherhood. She doesn't post on social media. She rarely gives interviews. Her calendar is no longer dictated by film festivals, press junkets, or premiere nights. It's dictated by breakfasts with her children, school pickups, home-cooked dinners, walks through the garden. A life not built for attention, but for meaning. Her real estate holdings span over $39 million, a reflection not of excess, but of foresight. She has invested in land, in space, in privacy, a quiet empire where her children can grow away from the shadows of fame, where love can live uninterrupted. And yet, though she's no longer on the marquee, Sandra Bullock's presence hasn't faded. Because her legacy was never just the roles. It wasn't just Annie on the runaway bus, or Lee Ann Tuohy in the football drama, or Ryan Stone floating through space. It wasn't just rom-coms, or thrillers, or action blockbusters. It was resilience. It was compassion. It was the decision to rise over and over again without needing to announce the climb. She reshaped what it meant to be a woman in Hollywood, not just to be bankable, but to be powerful. Not just beautiful, but truthful. Not just likable, but real. She created space for herself in a system that often had no room for complexity. And then she turned around and created space for others, producing shows, opening doors, mentoring voices that would otherwise go unheard. She showed the world that motherhood could coexist with ambition, that loss could birth wisdom, that fame means nothing if it isn't anchored in authenticity. And in the end, Sandra Bullock didn't just play the hero. She became one quietly, steadily, and without applause. Her true legacy is not on the silver screen. It's in the choices she made when no one was watching. In the children she loves fiercely. In the man she cared for until the end. In the millions who saw a part of themselves in her vulnerability, her humor, her strength. She is not seeking a comeback. She is seeking wholeness. And in a world that often rewards noise, Sandra Bullock remains a flame that burns in silence, unshaken, undimmed, still shining. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. And if you'd like to honor the legacy of artists who inspire quietly and live with grace, consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories that matter. Stories of strength, of humanity, of the legends who never fade. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which Sandra Bullock role changed how you saw the world? Subscribe to USA Legends Never Fade and help us keep these stories alive.